Welcome to Forsaken by Shadows, a production of stories by Sarah Danielle. This chapter is dedicated to Matt, my first dungeon master. I only got into this hobby because of you, and now it's kind of taken over my life. Thanks for the dice obsession I didn't know I needed. Previously, on Forsaken by Shadows, from Risman's point of view. Mazira's dislike of tea might possibly be the most adorable thing since her dislike of pomegranates. And while I do feel a stab of guilt over the fact that she only dislikes it because she's never had the chance to learn to love it, I can't help but admire her efforts to convince the others she enjoys it when she so clearly does not. This time we spend at the table is easy and relaxing, and I've never laughed so much at once in my life. If this is a taste of the future to come, then I cannot wait to get there. But as we settle in, it becomes more and more apparent that the woman, Lena, is not a normal drow. She acts like a child, playing with her sugar and tea things and ignoring the rest of us. I admit I am curious, but it is Mazira who is caught staring. She is not reprimanded, but instead invited to ask about it. Mazira is clearly uncomfortable with the question, so I ask, and we are told a sad tale. Lena's history is shrouded in mystery. She was found on the brink of death by a sanctuary guide, and over the course of time revived. Yet though her body recovered, her mind has never been the same. Yet even though she has reverted, she has been given a second chance in life that would be impossible in Menzoberranzan. The charity of these people is astonishing. We learn that after she attached herself to Beltal and Belnir, the twins chose to adopt her as their sister, taking on the responsibility of her care and well-being. We learn their story next, how they were born second and third son in their family, but no one can remember which was which. Third-born sons are meant to be sacrificed to Loth, but a conveniently timed house raid left their matron unable to remember which child was meant for the altar. Out of fear of offending Loth, both were spared until one proved to be worthier than the other. This, for obvious reasons, didn't sit well with them. But rather than compete for their lives, they worked together to ensure they both survived, eventually leaving home. One thing led to another, and now we are all about to be home, at this place they call the Sanctuary. Forsaken by Shadows, Part 2, Where Silence Echoes. Chapter 12, Sanctuary. Risman's heart thrummed as Styx's words reverberated through the cabin. We're home. Well, they were home. He and Mazira were nervous guests, eagerly anticipating the next step in this mysterious voyage. Actually, scratch that. He was nervously eager. Judging by Mazira's waxen pallor, she was just nervous, and probably afraid. She had been doing so well, too. Risman took a breath, biting back the tides of rising frustration. Time, Torfane had said. She just needed time. She would get there, and after the past hour or so of conversation, Risman was more optimistic than he'd ever been in his life that this place, this sanctuary, would be what she needed to get there. Oblivious to Mazira's distress, Beltal and Styx leapt to their feet, the teacups all but forgotten. The tiefling waited for no one, but bounded for the door, nearly tripping over a jar in her haste to get to the deck. It's about time, Beltal said, rolling his shoulders and cracking his neck from side to side. Not that this little excursion hasn't been fun, of course, he added, with a glance Risman's way. Totally worth almost getting eaten by a turtle. Wait. He frowned. Turtle doesn't sound right. We cannot take that story back to the cove. You should go take a look, Belnir cut in. The gates are quite a sight." He started to rise as well, then wobbled and dropped back to his seat with a groan. Lena flung her arms out to steady him, and the mirth faded from Beltel's eyes. "What are you doing?" he chided. "You've been ordered to rest." "I have rested. I am rested," Belnir grumbled, waving Lena away. "It's just the resurrection sickness, or whatever Solaran said. I can handle a bit of sailing chores." Lena's eyes grew sharp and shrewd as she shook her head. She latched onto his arm as if she intended to hold him there. "I can help," Risman offered, desperate to do anything to prove his worth. "So you can stay with her." Belnir tried to smile, but he was still attempting to shake Lena off. "That's very kind of you, but this is probably the one and only time you'll get to sail into our harbor as guests. We'll put you to work next time, I promise." He glanced at the woman and sighed. "Will you let me up if I promise not to do anything taxing?" Lena considered for a moment, then shook her head. "She knows you better than that," Beltel said. "You can come watch. But if I see you so much as look at that rope, I will drag you back here myself." Belnir rolled his eyes, but Lena released him. There was no wobble when he got to his feet this time. "And here I thought I was the captain," he muttered, which struck Risman as an odd thing to say with Torafane so clearly in charge. "Not on this patrol," Beltel grinned. "Make sure he behaves, Lily." And with that, he followed Styx onto the deck. Belnir trembled as he moved around the table, with Lena lurking close at his side. It might not have been a bad idea for him to rest more, after all, but Risman kept his thoughts to himself. It wasn't his business. Instead, he moved to follow, taking 2 steps before he realized something vitally important. Mazira hadn't moved. She remained seated at the table, her gaze dropped to her lap. His shoulders slumped. "Mazira, don't you want to see?" Mazira sat quietly for a moment, then lifted doleful eyes to him. She took a deep, tremulous breath and said, "Yes?" The word came out a little breathy, and she swallowed. "Yes," she repeated, stronger this time. "I'm ready." Though she shook as much as the recently revived Belnir, she rose straight and tall, squaring her shoulders. The soft glow of Styx's cabin tangled through her dark curls, threading glimmers of light through her strands. And Risman remembered Beltel's words about all the range of color and texture surface folk were blessed with. And it was like seeing her again for the first time, when he beheld her in the light of the chapel's faerie fire. Her skin smooth and polished like quartz, contrasted with the ebony adamantine the mercenaries had clad her in. And her eyes, her dazzling, lavender eyes, which caught the light of the cabin and danced the color about, like amethyst in candlelight. Risman stood frozen, struck by just how beautiful she still was. Even after everything they'd been through, the wear of battle and survival only seemed to accentuate her natural glory. Maybe it was the tea, or this new, burgeoning optimism that filled him with such hope, but Risman couldn't keep his thoughts to himself. "Wow," he found himself saying. "I was wrong. Your eyes aren't faerie fire at all. They're too beautiful for magic to replicate." Mazira went stiff and rigid, her jaw dropping as she stared at him like a cornered kobold who'd wandered too close to dark elven shrines. "What did you just say?" Her voice was almost a whimper. Panicked, Risman snapped out of his mesmerized daze. What had he said? It was suddenly very warm in the cabin, and Risman's hands went scrubbing through his hair. "That is, what I mean is..." But there was no getting around it. By the look on Mazira's face, she had heard quite plainly what he'd said, and she didn't receive it as the compliment he'd intended it to be. Flustered, he tried to dig his way out of this collapsing tunnel, I just think you're beautiful, and I thought you should know. Like, Lena. But as he said it, he knew it was the wrong thing to say. Mizira's jaw clicked shut and the color drained from her cheeks. She turned her face away and, to his astonishment, pushed past him to make a break for the deck. It was the first time in their lives she had preceded him anywhere, the first time she'd moved on alone. Risman just stood there, watching her go ahead of him, feeling all the weight of his brash stupidity. What was wrong with him? Whatever had possessed him to open his mouth in the first place? Not only was he walking in the same shameless footsteps he'd just judged Beltel for, he had done so to Mizira. Mizira, who probably still hated him despite recent evidence pointing to the contrary. Or, at the very least, just didn't want to be reminded that he'd once tried to love her, or still loved her, or whatever this God's forsaken obsession really was. Whatever it may be, it didn't give him, a lowly male who had contributed to her scars, the right to think he could just tell her how beautiful she was. No, that privilege was reserved for someone else. Some mysterious man of the future who could hold her heart and piece it back together for her. How Risman hated that future mysterious man. With his newfound optimism thoroughly trounced, Risman stalked to the deck, hardly remembering why he wanted to see the sanctuary in the first place. He shut his eyes as he crossed the threshold, leaving the world of the natural spectrum behind in Styx's cabin. When he opened them again, the caverns were awash with cool blue stones and warm red bodies. Mizira had made it as far as the first few steps beyond the door, where she stood now, looking uncertain. When she saw Risman, her temperature spiked, but at least she didn't bolt away from him. Risman glanced around, looking for somewhere else to busy himself so as to not make her even more uncomfortable, but he was at a loss for what to do. Belnir sat slumped against the cabin wall, exactly where he and Mizira had rested earlier. Beltel and Lena coiled a rope at the prow, and Styx and Torfane stood at the helm. Their conversations were lost to the sound of the river, which thundered alarmingly louder than it had the last time he had been on deck. "Feeling rested?" Solarin asked, catching Risman off guard as he came to stand in the gap between himself and Mizira. Mizira tensed, but rather than drop her gaze, she kept her chin elevated, nodding her hands together in front of her. The priest didn't wait for an answer, but was already rambling on. "I, for one, feel as though rest has only made me more tired, and still so much to do. Ah, well, at least we're returning to civilization. On that note, I advise you not to try to take it all in at once. There will be plenty of time for that later." For as tired as he claimed to be, the cleric's words came at their usual swift pace. At least the accent was getting easier to discern. It was tempting to ask him where he was from, but now didn't seem like the right moment. Instead, Risman considered the events of the last day, or however long it had been. Everything from being rescued and the strange vision of healing to meeting the others and fighting a monstrous dragon turtle, singing warrior women, strange goddesses, and Mizira wielding magic and hating tea. He'd experienced more vibrancy of life in the last few hours than he had in all his 25 years. It was hard to believe anything else could faze him now. "I think I've met my capacity for strange wonders in one day," Risman said, quite truthfully. Solarin's lips twitched in amusement. "Well, I do hope you prepare yourself for more. Our city may be fairly small, but its capacity to shock outsiders is becoming legendary. Much like yourself, young Tyr." Risman grimaced. The last thing he ever wanted was to become legendary. Legends had a way of inviting challengers, and Risman had no desire to be challenged for a title he had neither wanted nor earned. Solarin must have read his thoughts. "Not to worry," he said with a clap on the shoulder. Should anyone try to idolize you, I'll be sure to describe in great detail the sorry state I found you in. It took Risman a moment too long to realize the comment was meant to be light-hearted. By the time he figured it out, the cleric had moved his attention to the front of the boat. Oh, and you should know, no matter what your eyes perceive, don't panic. What? Why? Risman asked, immediately panicked. Mazira gave Solarin a startled look and edged a little closer to Risman. Unfortunately, the priest still stood between them, so that she couldn't quite close the distance without rudely cutting him out of the conversation. If Solarin noticed he'd alarmed them, he didn't show it. The transition through the gates looks terribly dangerous. I assure you, nothing is further from the truth. What does that... Risman began, but the boat gave a sudden, violent rock, sending everyone staggering. Brace yourselves, Styx called. A little sooner next time, Beltel hollered back, rubbing his hip where it had smashed against the railing of the deck. Sorry, but maybe just hold on tight. The current picked up and their vessel shot along. Beltel and Lena hunkered down by their coils of rope, and Belnir reached up and grasped the windowsill. Solarin nodded as if this all made sense to him, lowering his own center of gravity as he knelt, gripping the doorframe. Risman took his cue from the others. He grabbed Mazira by the wrist and pulled her back to the cabin door beside the priest. They stooped together, Risman keeping her safely encircled in his arms as he held onto the frame. The boat rocked again, and the back of her skull smashed into his chin. Risman grunted, and it was all he can do to hold on as the boat continued to thrash them about. His muscles burned with the strain. When at last there was a lull, he muttered in her ear, "You are too stiff. You need to relax, or the motion of the waves will keep throwing you." Mazira turned her face just enough so he could see her baleful glare, catching him completely off guard. He knew he'd upset her earlier, but he hadn't realized how much. Chagrined, he was tempted to let her go and give her the space she so clearly wanted, but the irrational thought that she might be flung overboard if they hit another rough patch kept him adhered to her side. Sure enough, the current set their vessel careening through the air once more. Risman was ready this time, and managed to avoid another unpleasant collision with the already livid woman he loved. When the next break in the jolting came, he glanced at Solarin. "You're sure this is normal?" "Normal?" the cleric said, unperturbed by the rapids. "Of course not. This is by design." "Design?" Risman echoed, but his question was lost to the tumult. And then, looking ahead, he saw why. The river ended abruptly. There was nothing before them but the blackness of a wide open cavern. They were headed straight for a waterfall. A massive one, by the sounds of it. Risman whipped his head back to the cleric, whose placid features were set in stark contrast to what Risman's own eyes beheld. Looking around, he realized no one was concerned. Or, if they were doing a marvelous job hiding it. Risman did his best to take his own advice and relax his muscles, but he couldn't get the sight of imminent doom out of his mind. He pressed into Mazira, hoping to shield her from whatever collateral fallout was about to come their way. As the boat thrashed ever closer to the end, Risman's doubts skyrocketed. Maybe Mazira was right. Maybe they shouldn't have trusted these strangers so easily. Their kind words could have been lies, after all. The drow were capable of remarkable levels of treachery. He definitely should have asked some far more important questions about their destination. The thrashing and turmoil ceased as the boat shot out into midair. For a brief, horrifying second, they hung suspended. Risman reached for his innate levitation magic, but the need to catch himself never came. One moment, the boat was hovering in darkness. The next, a gentle lapping returned as they sailed through calm, still waters. See? Perfectly safe. Solarin rose and dusted off his robes. Risman sat back, blinking as his eyes adjusted spectrums yet again. Somewhere behind him, the waterfall pounded away, but before him was a wondrous sight. Dusky, orange-tinged light suffused the entirety of the chamber, displaying a city that stretched between the stalactites and stalagmites like a strand of black pearls. Even from this distance, Risman recognized the fine curves and angles of drow architecture. More than that, however, he couldn't yet see. Most of the view was taken up by what he assumed were the gates. An ebony wall, probably 20 feet high, surrounded the civilization. The ends of it came together in the center of the river, which had tripled in width, each edge punctuated by a gargantuan statue. Risman got to his feet, staring in awe. The figure on the left was an elegantly carved female, clad in armor and grasping a sword thrust downward to her breast. Her other arm, the one facing toward the water, was missing, rounded off at the shoulder. The second statue was her mirror image, except for one very significant detail. The figure was male. In all his life, Risman had never once seen an idol fashioned after a male. He couldn't help but stare up into his somber, stoic features as the boat sailed towards the gap between the figures. "They're called the Watchers," Solarin said, noting where Risman's attention had gone. "When they raise the gates, their images are complete. Outstretched arms to bar the way of those who would do us harm. And judging by the light, I dare say we got here just in time." They passed between the solemn figures, and Solarin waved acknowledgement to the soldiers who stood on the wall. "Ah, that reminds me. The light," the priest continued. "The color is important. It is how we tell our time. See how it is orange now? It is the equivalent of what the surface folk would call evening. It will bleed slowly into red, our night, to blue, our morning, and so on. You'll catch on. The streets are always lit, since not every being who lives here is blessed with their own natural abilities of sight. Ah, are you all right?" Solarin had finally looked their way, and judging by his tone, Risman hadn't done a very good job covering his surprise. That, or he was concerned by Mazira's spellbound expression, a level of emotion Risman hadn't seen from her in a long time. They had sailed into a harbor, or at least, that's what Risman thought these docks and boats meant. He'd only ever heard of the concept before. The streets on either side were lined with small buildings, shops and taverns, even some residences. And among those establishments were people. Dozens of people. So many more people than Risman could remember ever being surrounded by, even though Menzo Berenson could have easily swallowed this cavern whole. But after 4 months of utter silence and near solitude, the sudden bustle and noise of a thriving community was jarring, to say the least. Yet more shocking than the light and the sights was the sound. Music radiated throughout the chamber as an echoing chorus of voices and instruments. Torafane had said that where they were going, everyone sang, but Risman didn't realize that he meant everyone. With a cacophony this great, he doubted there was a single voice unraised. Except, of course, for Solarin, who still stared at him with increasing concern. "Sorry," Risman said, shaking himself out of his stupor. "Yes, I'm all right. It's just..." "A strange wonder?" The cleric finished for him, his eyebrow quirked. "Gracious, if only someone had warned you." Risman was about to be offended when he caught the amusement in the other drow's eye. This wasn't an insult, it was a jest. He bit back the retort he had summoned for his defense, and instead let his eyes return to the scene before him, taking in this extraordinary new world. Unconsciously, he reached for Mazira's hand, and had grown so used to finding it there waiting for him that his heart lurched when she moved it away. Oh, right. She was still mad at him. Speaking of strange wonders, Belnir said as he pushed himself to his feet. He grunted as though the effort pained him, but waved Solarin away before he could say anything. It appears the song breeze is drawing a crowd. Risman turned his head to follow Belnir's gaze, focusing more deliberately on the people individually and less on the city as a whole. Belnir wasn't wrong. As Styx navigated towards an empty stone dock, several were pointing them out, whispering amongst themselves. A crowd began to gather and follow along their course. "Told ya you were famous," Beltel said, joining their circle. "Let's hope some of that glory rubs off on us. We did all the charity work, after all." "It's not charity if you expect to get something out of it," his brother replied. "Wait, this is because of me?" Risman asked, aghast. The gathering crowd was increasing to a swarm. "Well, probably not just you," Beltel said. "There was much lamenting and song for your darling companion when Thorfinn came back with the tale of what we all assumed was her murder. This is exactly the kind of heartwarming resolution that will be touted here for centuries." Mizera flushed under the orange light, but though she stared in horror at the sight of the milling crowd, she didn't draw near to Risman for comfort. He'd really crossed a line with her. Now, Solarin said. "It could also be the very blatant and obvious damage to the ship. Don't trouble yourself over it." He folded his arms into his sleeves. "They've all got their own business to attend to. Once they get their looking, they'll mind it." "That's optimistic," Beltel quipped. "Small towns do like their big gossip." "Hey, Doar!" Styx called from above them. When both twins and Lena looked her way, she sighed and added, "The loud one! Quit jabbering and tie her off!" The boat bumped into the dock, and Beltel tossed Styx a sarcastic salute before returning to help Lena with the ropes. Belnir excused himself and disappeared into the cabin. "Solarin," Risban muttered, now that it was just the three of them again. "What happens to us now?" "Now?" Solarin shrugged. "Well, that's for the Reverend Mother to decide. I have my suspicions, but I don't dare speak for her." Risman was suddenly very cold. "The Reverend Mother?" he repeated. "Indeed," the priest said, regarding him with a calculated look. "Does that trouble you?" "No," Risman lied. The phrase sounded entirely too much like matron mother for his comfort. Solarin's flat expression told Risman he wasn't believed. He tensed, expecting a sharp reprimand, but all the cleric said was, "It would be understandable if it did. It is true that much of our society is different from what you left behind, yet much of it mirrors the structures those who founded our community grew up with as well. I think rather than tell you all of what to expect, you'd benefit best from experiencing it yourself and drawing your own conclusions." "Right," Risman mumbled, shifting awkwardly. Fortunately, he was saved from the need of a more articulated response by the reappearance of Belnir, who emerged from the cabin with a fresh pawafui over his ruined armor and a pack slung over his shoulder. He carried two more by the straps in one hand, which all amounted to far more weight than Risman thought he ought to be carrying in his condition. "It's never lost on me," Belnir said, glancing out over the harbor. "How wonderful it feels to be happy to be home. Thank you for the honor of your hunt, Solarin." "Thank you for the honor of your presence," Solarin replied, bowing over his folded arms. "May the Dark Maiden brighten your shadowed steps." The exchange felt something like a ritual, and Risman looked away. Though he knew nothing of the deity they called upon, the fact that they called upon one at all made him uncomfortable. And though Solarin said the same deity gave Mizera her magic, Risman wasn't quite ready to believe it yet. He liked these people, trusted them even, but deities he could not trust. Yet before he could fret over it further, Torfane jumped down from the upper deck and landed deftly beside the cleric. "You and I are going straight to the temple," he growled to Solarin. He turned his red gaze to Belnir. "You and your siblings are dismissed. Thank you for a job well done." Solarin inclined his head, producing a coin pouch from the folds of his robes. "My share of the faerie fee," he said, handing it to the commander. Belnir produced a similar sack, though his was considerably larger. "For all of us of the Doar clan." He, too, inclined his head respectfully. Then they both walked away, leaving Risman and Mazira alone with Torfane. For one terrifying moment, Risman feared that the warrior was about to turn to them for payment, but he merely set the contributions aside and crossed his arms over his considerably broad chest. "We're going to the Temple of Elestre," he said, and Risman felt that same sense of dread as when the boat had shot over the waterfall. "The Reverend Mother will decide what becomes of you and Mazira. Emilara is her name, but you will address her as Mother, or Reverend Mother, not Matron." "Yes, sir," Risman said, as if he never left the halls of Melee Magther behind. Torfane nodded, and Styx hopped down beside them. "All set," she declared. "A pleasure doing business with you, Torfane. Though next time I'm charging double in case of any undisclosed hazardous dragon turtles." Torfane's expression never moved. "For every patrol who wishes to book your ferry, or just mine?" "Definitely just you." She flashed him a smile. "Give my love to Saria." "If you plan to linger, I'm sure she'll visit." Torfane handed her the coin purses he had collected, and one more, presumably his own payment. Risman didn't know how much was in those sacks, but the thought that they might be full of gold and not silver left him a little sick. How many resources had been spent on recovering them? "If you have any belongings to gather, gather them," Torfane said. "Otherwise, we'll go and join the others." He disappeared into the cabin and re-emerged a moment later with a rucksack slung over his shoulder. The others had moved onto the dock, not wandering far from the boat. The crowd had gathered at the end of the pier, a mass of hushed whispers and pointed stares. From within their ranks, a smaller figure pushed through, bustling towards their party. Risman, of course, had nothing to gather. He glanced down at Mazira and offered her his hand, but she shook her head, her expression steeled over. Disappointed, he settled for staying near her as they followed Torfane off the boat. They joined the others at the same moment the small man from the crowd reached them. At least, small as far as height was concerned. The portly creature stood about half as tall as Risman, with stone-colored skin and a round, bald head. With a start, Risman realized he was a deep gnome, a Zvirfnibling, as they were called. One of the most hated enemies of the drow. Yet if the gnome knew his species was loathed by dark elves, he didn't act like it. He didn't seem at all troubled to be surrounded by drow, but instead peered up at them with a dour expression, until he noticed Torfane. "Ah, Commander," he exclaimed, in a much deeper voice than Risman would have expected. "Pleasure it is to see your exposition successful. All is well and good?" "Well enough, Harbor Master," Torfane replied. "The journey has been long and we are tired." Yes. There is, of course, the matter of the questioning." The gnome cast curious eyes towards Risman and Mazira, before looking back to the commander. "Shall we commence?" Torfane nodded. The harbor master reached into a pouch and produced a smooth stone orb about the size of his palm. He held it aloft and spoke a foreign word, igniting the orb with bright, brilliant light. Risman flinched, but after a moment he adjusted to the glow. "Travelers," the gnome said gravely, "you have been outside our gates for considerable time. Before we welcome you back into our fold, we must have your confessions. The orb of truth will sift your words. State your true name for the record." At the Swerfniblin's request, a strange feeling washed over Risman, like a tugging on his soul. Though he had intended to linger back for this unknown encounter, he found himself compelled to answer. As the others all spoke their names, Risman added his own voice to the chorus. Rismantir. Even Mazira gave her name, her eyes wide and startled as she spoke it. The only one who hadn't spoken was Lena, who wore an odd, strained expression. In the moment of silence which followed, Belnir spoke for her. "We do not know her true name, but we call her Lena Doar." Very good, the gnome grumbled. "Now then, have any of you knowingly been bewitched, bribed, or otherwise compromised by one of our enemies?" Before Risman could even work out what was being asked, he found his lips parting as they all spoke at once. "No." This time, Beltal spoke for Lena. "She has not left my company. I can attest to her surety." Again, the gnome nodded. "Have any of you willfully returned with malignant intent for Launa, the city we call Sanctuary, or any who call this place their home?" "No." The Zwerfniblin looked them each up and down, before bobbing his head with satisfaction and pocketing the orb. With the loss of the light came a feeling of relief. "Welcome home," he said, with a little bow that Risman thought might topple him over. "I must conclude with your fairy woman now." There were murmurs of gratitude as the gnome moved around them. Torafane set off at once for the street. I can't wait to be home," Beltel said, as he gestured for Risman and Mazira to go ahead of him. Risman obliged, and though the stone beneath his feet seemed solid enough, he still felt the swaying of the songbirds in his steps. He narrowed his eyes as he focused on keeping his path straight. "We timed this expedition perfectly," Beltel continued. "A full night's rest and then back to patrol tomorrow." "Don't you mean training for you, novice?" Belnir cut in. Beltel's face fell. "He told you?" 10 days, I heard. And you better believe he'll make sure Anders knows about it before blue light, so no patrol hopping. What'd you do this time?" "Nothing at all." "He broke the silence and then argued about it," Risman said, before he realized he probably should have kept his mouth shut. Beltel shot him a withering look, but Belnir broke out into laughter. "Why did I even ask? I could have guessed that." Beltel merely sighed, tossing up his hands. "Come on, you're not really going to enforce that on me, are you?" "Of course I am," Belnir said, looking affronted that Beltel would insinuate otherwise. "I'm not going to undermine another captain's orders." "But you'll be a warrior short," Beltel whined. "Who are you going to call up from the reserves to replace me?" "Maybe I'll call up Risman," Belnir said, with a wink his way. "He held his own against Mendraktoven." Beltel put on a dramatic show of looking pained. "What? You would take an elflet over your own kin?" "In a heartbeat," Belnir deadpanned. "But if you behave well, I'll see if I can lessen your sentence." "Wait," Risman said, as he stitched together the implications of their conversation. Suddenly, previous comments started to make more sense. "Are you a patrol captain?" "Unfortunately," Beltel muttered. "What's the point of serving under your brother if you can't even abuse the privilege?" "You defied orders," Belnir shot back. "Unlike you, I know how to follow a command." The two fell into bickering, but Risman was too busy working through the revelation to notice. It didn't fit into his understanding of power. He'd never met a captain who had willingly set aside their own authority to yield to another's. There was no precedent for this that he could call on. "So, if you're a captain," he said, not realizing he was interrupting their squabble, "then that makes him—" He nodded to Torfane's back. Belnir shrugged. "He's whatever he wants to be, in between tours. The guides get that sort of privilege since they're usually away from home for so long. Which is just further proof that he should have no say in my future," Beltel interjected. But Risman wasn't listening to him. He was too busy plumbing new depths of unconventional behavior. "So, then..." His hands worked in little circles as he tried to figure out how to word his question. "You didn't... He didn't... None of you had to do any of this?" "Had to," Beltel echoed, still sulking. "No one has to do anything. Except me, apparently." "We told you," Belnir added, gentler than his brother. "This mission was special. Solarian requested it, Torfane planned it, we volunteered, and everyone pitched in to hire Styx and her faerie. Though between you and me," Beltel added, his voice lowered, "Solarian could have funded this whole expedition with his pocket change." But Risman didn't care about that. He froze, unable to process the newfound emotion blooming in his soul. They'd said before they had volunteered for this mission, but just because one volunteered didn't mean they actually had a choice. Hadn't Torfane said he'd come for them because it was his job? Risman just assumed he'd ordered the others to go along with him. But if what they were saying was true, then that meant they had not only no obligation to anyone to risk their lives for him, they'd actually wanted to. For reasons he couldn't comprehend, and at great personal cost to themselves, these strangers strolled out of their safely walled city on a quest to locate him. Well, locate Mazira, if the priest was to be believed. But if he were, then that was even more unfathomable. What sort of drow went out of their way for a faerie? "I don't understand," Risman said, before they got too far ahead. "Why would you do all of that? All that coin and your time spent, not to mention how dangerous the dark is. Just for us." The brothers stopped and looked at each other, seeming just as baffled by his question as he was by their statement. "Why wouldn't we?" Belnir asked. "Because it's what we do here," Solarian said, making Risman jump as he came up behind them. "Now do keep moving. Torfane is going to be rather perturbed if he has to wait for us." "Sorry," Risman mumbled, hurrying forward to take his place next to Mazira. His hand twitched to take hers again, but he stopped himself just in time. He didn't think he could handle another rejection. They reached the stairs at the end of the dock, and Risman glanced up into the waiting crowd, hoping to find another anchor for his reeling heart in the normalcy of society. What he found instead was more reason to be astonished. There were dozens of people waiting there, and only half of them were drow. The other half was so varied that Risman's head spun as he tried to take in all the details at once. Creatures he'd been taught to hate on sight now muttered and pointed at him. But rather than suspicion or hostility, there was relief, joy, and curiosity etched onto their faces. It was the strangest assortment of beings he had ever encountered, and he was suddenly quite self-conscious. All too soon, they had crested the top of the stairs, and if the pointing and muttering had made him self-conscious, it was nothing to the sudden burst of applause and shouts of acclamation. "Welcome home! You survived! Is that the Tear Boy? He's very tall. She really is alive! Praise Elistrea!" Of that last phrase, there were many voices echoing. Praise Elistrea. It sent shivers down his spine, which felt strange in contrast to the heat that burned through his blood. Risman edged as close to Mazira as she would let him. Never, in all his life, had he received so much attention. Unless he was being publicly humiliated in front of his class, a rite which every student experienced at least once, no matter how unobtrusive they tried to be. Somehow, this was entirely worse. Mizira must have felt it as well. When his hand brushed hers, she latched onto it, her finger squeezing his so tightly his bones popped. Beltel, however, seemed to recover his spirits completely. "Ah, my adoring fans," he sighed with an exaggerated bow. "Do, go on." There was laughter at that, and a few playful insults which only added to Beltel's preening. "Tell us what happened," someone cried out above the din. "We heard there was a dragon outside the rim." "It's true. I saw the songblades go out myself." "My dear people, please," Salaran called, his sonorous voice ringing with disapproval. He stepped forward and the crowd hushed noticeably. "You act as though we don't have protocols to follow. You know we must give our first report to Mother Lara and the council." The people called their complaints at once, something about having a right to know if there was a dragon threatening their community. Risman merely took the opportunity to sink behind the others, wishing the stone would open up and swallow him. "He is right," Torafane called, and this time there was no argument shouted back. Though no one flinched the way Risman would have had the commander addressed him in that tone, they did stiffen, and a few looked a little ashamed. "Go your way. There is no danger. Mother Lara will give the news at tonight's evensong if you permit us to make it to the temple before red light." And with that, the people began to disperse, though many were still offering their well wishes. Torafane glanced back and nodded his head, indicating Risman and Mizira were to follow him. Grateful for his chance to escape, Risman wasted no time in obeying. They had only made it a few steps before Torafane halted abruptly, his eyes locked on a woman who stood noticeably still as the throng moved around her. At her side was a girl who looked just on the brink of escaping childhood. "I'll catch up," Torafane muttered to Salaran, waving them on. Salaran nodded, then tipped his head in acknowledgement to the woman. He pressed a gentle hand to Risman and Mizira's backs to push them onward. Risman went, though his attention was entirely wrapped on Torafane as he went to the woman. Though her features were softer than the illustrations Risman had seen at Melee Magthair, he recognized her as a fairy elf, fair of skin and hair. The girl at her side, however, was something else. She was almost a drow, with her crimson eyes and colorless hair, but her skin was too light. All ash and smoke, not deep darkness. Had Risman not already met fairies to compare her to, he would have thought that's what she was. And maybe she was. Hadn't they just talked about all the different shades of the surface folk? As Torafane drew near them, the girl suddenly skipped forward. For a split second, Risman thought she was attacking the commander. That was usually what sudden movement indicated. Yet as her arms locked around his waist in a tight embrace, Risman realized she had done something far more alarming. She'd hugged him. And rather than shove her away, Torafane put his arms around her, before stepping out of her grip and doing the same to the fairy woman. Risman gawked, craning his neck as they moved past them on the street. The three of them stood close together, speaking in low voices. As Risman watched, the woman put her hand to Torafane's face, rubbing her thumb over the cut he had opted not to have healed, her expression tightening with concern. Torafane's hand covered hers, and then they were lost to his view as Salaran shifted into his line of sight. "It's rude to stare," the priest said lightly, "and terribly dangerous to walk without looking where you're going. You wouldn't want to fall into the river again, would you?" Risman snapped his attention forward. "Sorry," he said, an automatic response. "It's just that woman and the girl. Who are they?" "Who?" Salaran sounded surprised. "Why, I thought it would be obvious. Didn't Torafane tell you about his wife? I thought he said he was going to." Risman nearly tripped over his feet. His wife? That was her? The famed woman who had saved his life and turned his heart upside down? Risman started to look back again, but remembered the priest's rebuke. Somehow, he'd imagined someone more formidable, for lack of a better term. Not that she hadn't stood proud and tall, but she seemed so soft. "Oh," he said, trying to cover his surprise. "Right, he told me. I just wasn't expecting..." But whatever he wasn't expecting, he couldn't say, so he let his words trail off. "She's a lovely woman," Solarin remarked. "Makes the best hazelnut crumble in all the Underdark, if you are fortunate enough to have a chance to try it. Ah, but I suppose you haven't had anything hazelnut before. It's not a common import. Never mind, you'll enjoy it. Oh, and the girl, of course, is Sabrina, their daughter." Mazira jumped noticeably, and Risman gasped. Whatever he had expected Solarin to say of the child, it wasn't that. "Daughter?" he repeated, and this time he did swing his head around, but the multitude had completely blocked the family from view. "He never said anything about a daughter." "No?" Solarin shrugged. "I suppose that doesn't surprise me. He does like to keep things private. They have a son as well, but he is grown and away at the moment." "Right, of course," Risman said, reeling. But he supposed it did make sense, in a way. Hadn't Torfane said he'd been married for 2 centuries? Certainly he would have fathered children in that time. But it was one thing to father children. It was an entirely different thing to know your children and relate to them as well. It broke every social convention Risman had grown up with. He wondered, very briefly, what it would have been like to be hugged by his mother or acknowledged by whoever his father was. The thought made his skin crawl. It was just weird to think about. Solarin was chuckling now. "Dear me, I didn't expect that to be such a shock. I apologize. I suppose to save you from more unpleasant surprises, I shall inform you now that I have a daughter as well." Somehow, that shocked less. Perhaps because Risman had only just met Solarin and hadn't fully formed his opinions about him yet. "Oh," he said, because he didn't know what else to say. "Is that normal?" What he meant, of course, was to ask whether it was normal for fathers and daughters to relate to one another in this community. But as Solarin burst out into deep, rich laughter, Risman realized how foolish his question sounded. "Children are never normal. Hopefully, you will get to meet her soon. She is about your age, actually. I think you will like her, Mazira." Mazira jumped again when he addressed her directly, her face flushing. She muttered something incoherent, but Solarin didn't seem to notice. They had just rounded the corner onto a new street, leaving the riverfront behind, and Risman got his first real glimpse of the city they called Sanctuary. Thank you for listening to this episode of Forsaken by Shadows, written and produced by me, Sarah Danielle. As always, the music and ambience have been provided by Tabletop Audio and Pixabay. Forsaken by Shadows is unofficial fan content not endorsed by Wizards of the Coast. What new adventures await for Risman and Mazira now that they have reached the Sanctuary? And what will Mother Lara decide about their future fates? Subscribe to follow along and find out.